After the end of the classic Resident Evil trilogy, Capcom quickly got to work on making a fourth numbered title, but this would go on to be the most troubled development of the entire series so far. Development would start in 1999, but Resident Evil 4 wouldn't come out until 2005 due to the fact that the project was started, worked on for a bit, then scrapped and restarted so many different times. As far as we know publicly, there were at least 4 different builds that got scrapped during the production of RE4, with one of these builds famously going on to spawn another popular Capcom franchise, but that's a story for another day. The fifth and final attempt at developing Resident Evil 4 would see Shinji Mikami, the director of the original Resident Evil back on PS1, returning to direct the project once again. Mikami would state in an interview with Game Informer during the title's development that after playing the final version of Resident Evil 0, he felt the series' formula was really starting to feel like it was just more of the same, and that a large portion of the staff at Production Studio 4 were also feeling pretty tired of it. So for Resident Evil 4, they would take the franchise in an entirely new direction. They would go on to change the camera perspective, the controls, the setting, the enemies, the direction the story was moving in, just about everything that they could change, they changed. This was obviously an insanely risky move on their part, as many fans of the series would likely feel betrayed by such a sudden and drastic shift in direction. And this is normally the part of the video where I would pose some sort of hypothetical question about whether or not this risk would pay off for them, but come on guys, we all know Resident Evil 4, right? This game would go on to sell more copies than any previous title in the series had, bring in millions of new Resident Evil fans in the process, and leave a long-lasting legacy as one of the supposed greatest video games ever made. So I guess the question for today isn't so much did it work, but more so what made Resident Evil 4 so damn special? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 13th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but you'll definitely have some better context and probably get more enjoyment out of this video if you have seen the rest of them. So for those of you that are interested, I'll have the full series playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil 4 is a survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the Nintendo GameCube in 2005. In Resident Evil 4, we once again play as rookie cop turned hardened survivor Leon S. Kennedy. The game takes place in 2004, placing it 6 years after the Raccoon City incident. We're told in the intro cutscene for the game that the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, has been kidnapped by a mysterious cult and brought to some rural part of Europe. To find Ashley, the president sends Leon to Spain to search for her, and as you could likely predict, Leon quickly runs into the cult and gets himself caught up in an intense conflict with them in a strange and terrifying corner of the country. And instead of fighting against zombies like we have in literally every RE game up to this point, we instead fight against a small army of Spanish villagers who have been infected by a mind-controlling parasite known as Las Plagas. People infected with the Plagas parasites are known as ganados, a Spanish word meaning cattle or livestock. And aside from just the fact that these are normal villagers who have been infected by a parasite that's capable of completely controlling their minds, the body horror of the ganados is pretty intense when you start seeing how the parasite will do things like burst out of their bodies when threatened. While I have to admit that I'm partial to seeing zombies in a Resident Evil game, mostly because of childhood nostalgia, I have to say that I love the Plagas and the Ganados as well, and think that they make for an awesome new threat here in RE4. Now, this is obviously a dramatic, tonal, and thematic shift from the other Resident Evil games up to this point. But it's a really good setup in its own right, and I would be lying if I said that it wasn't a refreshing change after playing through 12 Resi games that all feel like variations of the same thing. Even though I've been a bit of a die-hard RE fanboy since I was a kid, I can totally admit that playing all the games that preceded this back to back really do make you feel just how repetitive the stories and the world building had gotten up to this point. And it makes RE4 feel like a fresh glass of lemonade on a hot summer day by comparison. That being said though, there is one thing about the basic story setup here that I've always hated. Also in the game's intro cutscene, we're told that the public eventually found out that Umbrella was behind the Raccoon City incident, and as a result, their stock prices started to crash and the company was dissolved shortly afterwards. This is effectively Capcom just throwing out the Umbrella Corporation as part of their new directional shift for the series. Don't get me wrong, I could totally live with us actually getting to see the downfall of Umbrella and then move on to some totally new things from that point on. But what's always rubbed me the wrong way about this is that they got rid of them off screen and then just said, oh yeah, and Umbrella is dead by the way, in the opening of the game. The Umbrella Corporation was the primary antagonistic force of literally every single game in the series up to this point, so abruptly being told that they're already dissolved rather than getting a proper climax where we actually see the destruction of the company in-game has always felt totally wrong to me. Something that feels so right about this massive overhaul though is the perspective shift during gameplay. Up to this point, the Resident Evil franchise was basically known for its fixed camera angles that gave it a uniquely cinematic presentation. But with RE4, they decided to remove these fixed cameras and instead use a third-person over-the-shoulder perspective. This ends up changing a lot about the gameplay, especially when it comes to controls. The game, interestingly, still uses tank controls in this perspective, but other things like the shooting are totally different now, since players now need to actually aim and fire at enemies from the perspective of Leon himself. This effectively turns Resident Evil 4 into an over-the-shoulder third-person shooter, which, while an incredibly common genre nowadays, was a pretty new and revolutionary thing at the time. Third-person shooters certainly existed prior to RE4, but the over-the-shoulder perspective was something that totally transformed the genre from this point on, with the directors of games like Gears of War, Dead Space, and even The Last of Us all citing Resident Evil 4 as a source of inspiration. And it's a perspective shift that I think works really well, since you still get to see your character from a third-person viewpoint, but it brings you a lot closer to all the horror and the action, making everything feel much more intimate here than it ever did in prior titles. That, and it just looks really cool, especially during those moments where they start playing with the camera a bit and framing certain shots with a little extra style. It's just really good stuff, man. And getting into presentation, RE4 is easily one of the best looking titles on Nintendo's GameCube. I've already said in earlier videos in the series that I personally think either the RE1 remake or RE0 take the cake as the best looking games on the system. But as far as titles using fully 3D rendering go, I feel like that award has to go to Resident Evil 4. Not only does it have some of the highest graphical fidelity that we would ever see on the GameCube, but it also has this just immaculate art direction throughout the entire game. From the rural villages of the early game, to the gothic Spanish castle of the midpoint, to the industrial militaristic island near the end, it all just looks absolutely amazing for a game released in January of 2005. Through these different areas, the atmosphere of the game shifts between three totally different tones throughout its runtime, yet each of them are just so captivating that I found myself spending a ton of my playthrough just getting lost in and exploring the game's map. And that's despite the fact that this was far from my first time playing the game. But with the game's new perspective, of course, comes a totally different approach to the combat. Combat here is a lot of fun, and if you ask me, it's likely the largest reason that the game is still so beloved to this day. Like I mentioned earlier, the game still uses tank controls for moving your character around, and most of the movement has stayed the same because of this. Pushing the thumbstick to the left will still rotate Leon to the left rather than seeing him strafing to the left, and you can still pull back on the stick and press the run button together to quickly turn 180 degrees. It's basically all untouched from games like Code Veronica or RE0. However, the big differences start when it comes to the shooting. A lot of things here also remain the same as in the original games, with players still needing to hold a button to ready their weapon and aim, and doing so still locking them into place and preventing them from moving around while firing their weapon. But since we're now over the shoulder, when you aim your weapon, the thumbstick now changes from moving Leon to moving where Leon is aiming. And in order to reduce the amount of on-screen clutter, the designers decided to give every single weapon in the game a laser sight that's very clearly visible to the player, rather than just using a traditional 2D crosshair. They even gave it a comically large dot at the end of the laser to make it incredibly clear to the player at all times where your bullet will actually land. This is a really nice and subtle way to implement an aiming reticle without just throwing a little 2D HUD element on the screen, and since I'm such a huge sucker for clever in-universe HUD design, I'm a massive fan of the laser sight here. And thanks to the fact that you still can't move while shooting, along with the massively increased number of enemies compared to the classic entries, your positioning is incredibly important in RE4. In fact, it might be the single most important skill for you to develop in the entire game. If you place yourself in a bad spot before opening fire on the Ganados, well, let's just say you're gonna have a bad time.
You're gonna have a bad time.
Along with positioning, you're going to have to be pretty good at prioritizing the appropriate targets, as there are a large variety of enemies here, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. Even the most basic Ganados can pose more or less of a threat than one another in certain situations, thanks to the surprising amount of different weapons they can carry. There are your Ganados with basic melee weapons, Ganados with throwable melee weapons, Ganados with explosives like dynamite, Ganados with shields, all sorts of Ganados. Then you've got your sort of mid-tier enemies like the Novistadors, which are these sort of humanoid insects that come in variations from camouflage Novistadors that crawl on the ground and the walls to flying Novistadors that attack you in swarms. And these guys were all apparently normal people at one time who were turned into these giant bugs through horrific experiments with Las Plagas. So again, the body horror in this game is really something else. And if I had to choose one late game enemy to showcase here, anyone who's played the game would know that I have to talk about the Regenerators. These were some of the more experimental Plagas weapons that the cult created, with these guys all hosting anywhere from 3 to 6 Plaga parasites per host, giving them incredibly rapid metabolisms that allow them to quickly regenerate parts of their bodies after they're harmed. This makes them virtually indestructible, unless you can directly kill each of the individual parasites inside of them. So the only reliable way to deal with them in-game is to find a thermal optic for your rifle and try to shoot the parasites within their bodies directly to take them down. So they offer one of the most unique challenges in the game and force you into really changing your playstyle to approach them. And aside from having one of the most disturbing visual designs in the game, they also sound like this. So yeah, there's a ton of enemy variety here in RE4, and I think what's really impressive about most of these enemies is that they all manage to maintain a similar level of horror to one another, which is something that's hard to say for a lot of the classic RE games, because as much as I love Code Veronica, what even is this design? What makes the enemy variety feel so much better than it already would though, is just the sheer amount of little interactions in this game. Shooting enemies in different parts of their bodies will allow you to do things like daze them with a headshot, shoot their weapons out of their hands, or even knock them to the ground by shooting them in the legs. Then building on that, if an enemy throws something like an axe at you, you can just shoot it out of the air. And if you've got a Ganado running up on you with a shield, you can shoot out parts of that shield with your weapons to get to the enemy behind it, with a close range shot from a shotgun being able to just completely destroy the shield in a single blast. These little interactions carry over to the environment as well, with Leon being able to do things like knock down ladders to prevent enemies from climbing up to where he is, push furniture around to barricade doors or windows, and of course, shoot an explosive barrel to kill a group of enemies with a single pistol shot. This insane level of interactivity doesn't just make the combat feel more immersive, but also keeps players actively engaged and thinking about what they're doing the entire time they're playing, while adding a ton of extra tactics and depth to the overall sandbox. It's just really good stuff, and incredibly impressive considering that most third-person shooters even nowadays don't offer the same level of depth in their mechanics. That being said though, there is one issue with the interactive sandbox of Resident Evil 4. This is one that I personally don't feel gets brought up often enough in discussions about this game, and that's just how incredibly powerful stunning enemies with a headshot is. Now, obviously you want to reward players for delivering a swift and skillful headshot in a third-person shooter, but the reward that RE4 gives you for pulling one of them off is so damn strong that it practically makes your positioning a non-issue if you can consistently pull them off. I mentioned just a minute ago that shooting an enemy in the head will stun them, but what I didn't mention is that anytime you stun an enemy, Leon can then run in for a roundhouse kick that will knock back not just that enemy, but also every other enemy around them. This stun effect is guaranteed on every single headshot, so to keep enemies off of you, even when you're in a bad spot, all you need to do is just land a single headshot, run into the group of Ganados approaching you, and press the big glowy button to kick all of them away. And even in the event that you're not dealing with a group, this is still your best option, because after you knock the enemy down with the kick, you can then run up and whip out your knife to just finish them off before they get up without using any ammo. I mean, seriously, the headshot into kick into knife flowchart is so incredibly effective that it still works against even the late game Ganados, and I'm sure that any of you who have played a solid amount of RE4 before have likely abused the hell out of this for years, much like I have. And I really couldn't blame you, or even myself for that matter, because it allows you to kill basically any basic enemy in the game with one single handgun shot. It's a shame that headshots are your best option roughly 90% of the time here, because there are so many cool interactions on offer that might as well just not exist, since you'll barely ever even see them once you figure out how effective this is. And I wanted to get a little bit into the discussion about the game and its mechanics before bringing this up, but if you couldn't tell already, RE4 sort of takes the very genre that Resident Evil has existed within up to this point and just moves away from it. Resident Evil for the PlayStation was the game that coined the term survival horror and really laid the groundwork for what that genre actually was. And while RE4 is labeled as a survival horror title by Capcom and by most fans, I would actually say that it's much more accurately described as an action horror title. Now, don't worry if you've been around in the Resi fandom for a long time, because I'm not one of those people who's going to scream at you and lose their mind because you consider RE4 to be survival horror. The game certainly has a lot of survival horror elements still present, but I just think that it removes enough of those elements and moves so far towards the action side of the spectrum that it's much more accurate to say this is an action horror title. From enemies dropping big glowy item drops on death, the hordes of enemies that are thrown at you in almost every single room, and even just the little things like shooting random birds in the environment rewarding you with extra cash, it just doesn't feel like a proper survival horror title to me. That being said though, I still love action horror games, and fully believe that these two approaches can and do comfortably coexist within the Resident Evil IP. I just think that this massive shift in the very genre that Resident Evil has existed in since its inception is something that I really do need to make mention of in a series like this. Continuing with the major shifts in core design philosophy, the way that the save system works is entirely different here. The iconic ink ribbon system from the classic Resi games is no longer present here, with players simply being able to save at typewriters whenever they want with no associated cost. And as much of a shame as it is to see the ink ribbon system go away, it was definitely for the best. With RE4 being the massive combat gauntlet that it is, and throwing hordes of enemies at you constantly the way it does, losing 30 plus minutes of progress on death just would not have felt good here. A lot of players already don't enjoy the ink ribbon system in the slower paced classic titles, so I can only imagine how much they would have hated it here as well. Along with changing how saving your progress works though, they also added checkpoints to an RE game for the first time. This again is something that I never would have wanted to see in the classic era titles, but it's a totally natural fit given RE4's overall design. Resident Evil 4's combat is incredibly fun and satisfying, but it also demands a lot from the player and isn't afraid to challenge you a lot, so you will die here way more often than you did in the classic titles. I think the most deaths I had during my playthroughs of the classic titles was a total count of like 4 during RE0, but during my playthrough of RE4, I had a little over 20 deaths total. And along with just generally being more demanding to play, this game also has certain encounters that are just really damn hard to get through, that new players will almost definitely get stuck on for a good few attempts. So again, using the traditional ink ribbon system where death means going back to your last save from however long ago and your saves are limited just wouldn't have felt very good here. On that note though, the level design and set pieces in this game are both incredible. The way that players navigate through the world and progress the story is unbelievably intuitive, despite the fact that the maps you'll be moving through are so large and have so many different paths that you can go down. Beyond that, the combat arenas are super well designed and just filled to the brim with choke points, interactive elements, and enemy combinations that will force you to engage with the game's mechanics on a deeper level. And seriously, the set pieces in this game are just so damn fun and practically guaranteed to be burned into your memory for years to come. I mean, come on, who could ever forget that opening fight in the village, the holdout in the cabin alongside Luis, or fighting off Ganados while flying through the underground tunnels in a minecart? Similarly, the bosses in this game are all incredibly fun and memorable as well. From the giant infected salamander of Del Lago to the experimental abomination of El Gigante, and of course, all of the primary antagonists of the game and the insanity that is each of their respective parasitic mutations. The only thing that I don't love about RE4's level design is the implementation of QuickTime events. They aren't necessarily overdone or anything, but I just really don't like it when I'm walking around and soaking in the atmosphere that the designers have crafted here, and then suddenly I'm running away from a boulder Indiana Jones style with this big colorful button on screen. And that example might sound really silly and cherry-picked, but that's far from the goofiest QTE that pops up in this game, and more than anything else, I just really don't like how much they disrupt the general tone of the game. There's nothing necessarily wrong with them gameplay-wise, as they are used pretty sparingly and they're really short when they do pop up, but it's just a personal preference on my part. Along with the awesome combat and level design though, there's also some pretty addictive progression that will keep you engaged throughout the entire game. The primary source of this progression is the game's merchant, who on top of allowing you to buy new weapons as well as upgrade the ones you already have, is just a really lovable guy.
Got something that might interest you. Got a selection of good things on sale, stranger. What are you buying? I'll buy it at a high price.
Jokes aside though, having a character in the game that will sell you new weapons and upgrades for your favorite weapons adds a really strong sense of character progression to the overall experience. He'll also buy items off of you if you want to turn some of your gear into extra cash, so while I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, you could always sell things like healing items or surplus ammo to him in exchange for some extra upgrades. There are even hidden treasure items in the game that, if found, can be brought back and sold to him for large amounts of money, rewarding players for taking the time to thoroughly explore the game's environments. Another thing that's really cool is that the developers added some sub-missions that you can complete for the merchant that essentially act as side quests, giving you something extra to do while playing through the rest of the level and rewarding you with something awesome like a new free handgun for completing them. These are really awesome additions to the overall progression here. All one of them. Yeah, so I kind of lied because the developers did add exactly that, but there is legitimately only a single one of these side quests in the entire game. This has always been one of the strangest things about RE4 for me, because having a simple yet fun distraction that feels genuinely rewarding to complete makes the game feel so much deeper for the 30 minutes that it's there, yet the team just didn't capitalize on this by adding even 2 or 3 more. The only submission on offer here also appears in the first of the game's 19 story chapters, and there's a whole entry on the map key to explain what the submission markers actually are, so it gives this weird false impression that this will be something you'll be engaging with for the rest of the game when it's really just a one-time thing. It's genuinely an amazing addition, which only makes it feel all the more disappointing when Capcom kind of just gave up on doing anything with it outside of the first hour of the game. Something that's really special about the progression though is that the weapon balance is really good here, which allows players to freely experiment with different combinations of weapons and find loadouts that are well suited to their specific playstyle rather than just finding the guns that are objectively better than the rest. Every single weapon in RE4 serves one very specific purpose within the overall sandbox, so you'll find players that love certain weapons and hate the others, and there are so many different opinions out there. In fact, the balancing is so good that it still has fans debating between certain guns to this day, which, while we're on the topic, the Punisher is better than Leon's USP and the Blacktail is absolutely better than the Red 9. There, watch the comment section turn into an absolute war zone off of those two statements alone. And as if we needed any more reason to love the merchant, he even sets up a shooting range for us to test our skills in, while rewarding us for completing the difficult challenges that he comes up with for it. The rewards aren't anything all that crazy, simply just being large chunks of money to use for other purchases, but who's gonna turn down the opportunity to get even more weapons and upgrades? It's a great little minigame that does a great job at breaking up the overall pacing, and if it doesn't seem like it's your thing, then you're totally free to just skip it and never engage with it at all. It's an awesome addition for those that will enjoy it, and for those that don't, you never have to touch it, so it's a net positive no matter what kind of player you are. Adding even more on top of all this other progression are the new yellow herbs. Well, not entirely new since they were first seen back in Resident Evil Gaiden of all games, but their implementation here is entirely different. In RE Gaiden, yellow herbs were a middle point between green herbs and red herbs, healing you for roughly half of your health rather than for a quarter or all of your health like the green and red did respectively. Here in RE4 though, the yellow herbs do nothing if eaten on their own. Mix them with some green or even some red herbs though, and the yellow herb will increase your maximum health value ever so slightly. They don't make a massive difference with each individual herb, but if you eat enough of them over the course of your entire playthrough, you can potentially double your maximum health cap by the end of the game. So they're not a massive addition, but they are one of those little items that will give you a dopamine hit every single time you find one, because you know that by using it, you can permanently make Leon stronger. And I really don't know how I've managed to go this long without mentioning it, but RE4 also has an entirely new inventory system compared to the classic games. Rather than having somewhere between 6 and 10 inventory slots and having every single item take up either 1 or 2 slots apiece, we instead get a much larger case that uses a grid-based system. Depending on the size of your case at any point in the game, you get a certain amount of tiles both vertically and horizontally, and each item in the game will take up a different amount of tiles based on their shape and size. If players want to make the most of the inventory space that's available to them, they'll have to figure out how they want to shuffle around and organize their inventory, finding a way to efficiently use that space while, of course, creating a clean and satisfying visual layout that you like. This is a really fun system that I don't think I've ever heard a single person complain about. It makes something as simple as navigating and organizing your inventory almost into a whole minigame in and of itself, and adds a whole new system for players to engage with during their playthrough. And much like I've said about a lot of RE4's larger changes, it's one that suits the general direction the designers wanted to take this game in incredibly well, while still giving players that trademark inventory management that we've come to know and love from the franchise. Now, after nearly 30 minutes of me being mostly positive on the game, we have to talk about the one thing that I saved for the end of the gameplay discussion. Any of you who have played RE4 before likely know what's coming, as it's probably the most contentious part of the entire game. Like I mentioned near the start of the video, the entire premise of the game's story is that Leon is going to Europe to search for and rescue Ashley Graham, the president's daughter. This premise, in isolation, might have you thinking that finding Ashley takes up the majority of the story, but in reality, we find Ashley at about the 20% complete mark. From this point on, Ashley will be accompanying Leon for about half of the remaining game, leading to the common criticism that Resident Evil 4 is nothing but a glorified escort mission. Now, this is admittedly a funny thing to say to describe the game, and chances are you'll likely hear me say it from time to time, but it's not because I think that it's true. Like I said, Ashley is only actually with you for roughly 40% of the game's total runtime, which while that is a lot of the game, it's still less than half of it. The developers at Capcom took basically every opportunity throughout the story to separate Ashley and Leon again, allowing them to constantly flip back and forth between simply playing as Leon and playing as Leon while also trying to defend Ashley. But more importantly than that, I think that describing the Ashley portions of the game as a glorified escort quest is incredibly reductive. When Ashley is with you, you aren't forced to follow her around the environments like you are in your average gaming escort mission. Rather, she'll stick behind Leon so closely that you might as well be carrying her in a baby Bjorn. And in the event that you don't want her getting that close to the danger, you can toggle her between following you and staying put with the press of a single dedicated button. The risk with that, though, is that the Ganados will of course be trying to kidnap Ashley back from you, so if you leave her on her own and stray too far away, she might get picked up by an enemy who slipped by you while you were fighting. In the event that she does get picked up by an enemy, Ashley will then start screaming for Leon, and players will have to rush over to rescue her, since a Ganado leaving the area with her will result in an immediate game over. This is something that might sound obnoxious on paper, but I personally find it to be a really fun and engaging dynamic. That being said though, some parts of escorting Ashley are admittedly pretty annoying. The first of these is that if Ashley happens to take any damage while she's with you, you'll have to use some of your own precious healing items to heal her, else you risk her dying, which would of course result in a game over. Since Ashley sticks so closely behind Leon, it's rare for her to actually get hit and is often more of a freak accident than anything, which makes it feel a little overly punishing to have to give up one of your own limited healing items in the event that that happens. Admittedly though, I can't really think of anything that would have been a better approach for healing Ashley, so I guess it's just kind of a symptom of needing to escort her in general. Additionally, there is friendly fire if you happen to accidentally shoot Ashley, with her just instantly dying to any amount of damage that's coming from Leon. This again feels a little too punishing for something that's effectively just a rare accident, especially since it's so incredibly easy to hit her leg instead of a Ganado's leg when trying to save her from capture. Trying to quickly rescue Ashley from being captured will almost always result in you hitting her instead of the enemy, but if you slow down to actually aim more carefully, there's a pretty good chance that you'll just lose her since the Ganados run off with her so quickly. And of course, there's the most common annoyance with escorting Ashley, her voice lines and personality. Now, I don't know what other players might think, but I personally don't think her voice lines are necessarily annoying on their own, but rather it's because she just screams the same 2 or 3 lines constantly whenever she's in trouble. And it doesn't exactly help her case that she just has a generally grating personality, even in cutscenes.
Are you out of your mind?
I knew you'd be fine if you landed on your butt.
Now, in fairness to the writers, Ashley is supposed to still be in her early college years here, so her having a bit of an obnoxious personality is probably intentional. That being said though, it doesn't mean that I have to like her as a character anymore because of that, and she still annoys me a good bit. On the topic of annoying personalities though, I have a bit of a spicier take that I just can't get through this whole video without mentioning. I have always hated Leon's characterization in Resident Evil 4.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
I get what they're going for here, I mean, I really do, but his overly cocky superhero attitude has just always rubbed me the wrong way, even back when I was a kid. It's not even entirely that his personality is irritating in isolation, though admittedly for me it kind of is. But in Resident Evil 2, we saw him survive the horrors of the Raccoon City incident and see the destructive power of bioweapons firsthand, only for him to then suddenly shift to this.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Since you're here, why don't I introduce you to it? It should keep you busy.
Can't remember the name, huh? A senior moment, perhaps.
What? All by yourself?
I'm sure you boys didn't just tag along so we could sing Kumbaya together at some Boy Scout bonfire. Then again, maybe you did.
I let our miserable insects out for some exercise down in the sewer.
Thanks. That should keep me company, 'cause boredom kills me.
It's always felt incredibly odd to me that Leon, being one of the only survivors of Raccoon City, would be so overwhelmingly calm in the face of another potentially world-ending bioweapon, even to the point where he's cracking jokes and seemingly just having a ton of fun with the whole endeavor.
No way, Leon.
Way?
It's just a really jarring change that, while it does feel in line with the general tone RE4 is clearly going for, feels incredibly out of place for Leon as a character. Now, if you made it this far into the video, I'm going to assume that you're already familiar with Resident Evil 4 and the events of its story. But in the event that you're not, I'm about to go a lot deeper into it, and I'm gonna end up spoiling a good bit of the game if you haven't already played it, so skip to the timestamp on screen if you're worried about avoiding spoilers. I think a large reason for the shift in Leon's character was almost certainly to match the tone of this game's antagonists, which are a whole other discussion in and of themselves. Fairly early in the game, you'll learn that both the Ganados and the kidnapping of Ashley Graham are linked to a cult in the area known as Los Illuminados. This cult is led by a man named Osmond Sadler, who, for reasons that aren't specified in-game, is capable of controlling the Plagas parasites and thus also controlling their hosts. He was able to manipulate a Spanish nobleman named Ramon Salazar into unleashing the parasites on the local population, which then provided him with a foundational army and workforce to build his cult on. From here, he would hire a researcher named Luis Serra to assist in learning more about how to multiply the Plagas parasites, as well as use them to create new and powerful bioweapons for his army. And since all of this was occurring in pretty much the middle of nowhere in Spain's countryside, it all went unnoticed, until the kidnapping of Ashley Graham. See, once Sadler had built up all this local power and influence, he was finally able to move into the final stages of his master plan. In order to spread the Plagas to the rest of the world and ultimately gain control of the entire human population, he would have some of his men kidnap the US president's daughter while she was on her way home from school. Once they brought her back to Spain, she was implanted with a Plagas parasite, with the ultimate plan being to hold her in the village until the Plaga in her body had matured. Then, once she was under Sadler's control, they would send her back to the US to influence the president's thinking and plant the seeds for a Los Illuminados takeover of the US government. This is honestly a really good setup for a genuinely terrifying antagonistic force, but aside from Sadler himself, it's kind of hard to take them seriously. The Ganados themselves have this sort of comedic quality to them, where they're constantly yelling at you in Spanish and screaming and wailing while you roundhouse kick them all over the combat arenas. But aside from that, the antagonists in this game are all pretty silly in their own right, with the big and intimidating village chief having a great opening, only to then be introduced as the Big Cheese.
The big cheese.
And the previously mentioned nobleman, Ramon Salazar, is easily the biggest goofball villain in the series so far. He's constantly being used as the butt of the joke in every single scene he appears in, and that, on top of his smaller stature and the fact that he throws fits like a toddler when Leon starts thwarting his plans, it genuinely makes it hard to see him as anything but a funny, yet ultimately helpless villain who just never stood a chance against Leon. And don't get me wrong, because as I've mentioned earlier in the series, I love a story with a more silly and comedic tone when it's entertaining, which Resident Evil 4 certainly is. But I just feel like all of the genuinely terrifying lore that they've built up around these antagonists ultimately falls flat because of how the tone of the story betrays them. That being said, there are a couple antagonists here that are genuinely really good, with the previously mentioned Osmond Sadler and also Jack Krauser. Krauser shows up near the end of the game and reveals to the players that he and Leon are old comrades and close friends. He was in the US Special Forces for years before being recruited by Lord Sadler to kidnap Ashley Graham. And in exchange for doing so, he was rewarded with his own special variant of the Plagas parasite that Lord Sadler couldn't control. Now, having a new character show up and just tell you that you should care about them because they know you isn't exactly great, but aside from that, he is a genuinely compelling character who feels tonally appropriate for what he's supposed to be within the story. And beyond that, he's revealed even later in the story to actually be a double agent for another party who's been working from the shadows this whole time, with him mentioning that Albert Wesker is his real boss and who he's actually loyal to here. Additionally, when Ada Wong makes her appearances in the story, we learn that she's working with Wesker and Krauser as well, yet neither of them really trust her. Oh yeah, and Ada Wong shows up here. After we saw her die in RE2, it was very heavily and let's be honest, obviously hinted at that she might have actually survived somehow. But as obvious as that was to us as members of the audience, the characters in-universe weren't supposed to know that she made it out. So when she shows up here, you'd expect Leon to be confused and maybe even feel betrayed that she faked her own death in front of him and then disappeared for 6 years. But instead, he just casually quips about how he had heard rumors that she was working for Wesker and doesn't even acknowledge the fact that this woman is supposed to be dead. Ada is another component of RE4's story that I've always kind of hated because she really just shows up out of nowhere, doesn't really do a whole lot aside from act mysterious for brief moments before disappearing again, and then show up to deliver a rocket launcher to Leon during the final boss fight as a quick callback to RE2. Now, there is a little more of an explanation as to her involvement in the game in a post-game campaign titled Separate Ways, but this campaign was never actually included with the original release of the game, and was only added when RE4 released on PlayStation 2 nearly a year later. Her involvement here just doesn't really make much sense within the story of the base game. But who can really say, because maybe it's setting things up for a potential sequel. To wrap up this fairly lengthy review though, Resident Evil 4 really is a special game. It changed just about everything that made me love Resident Evil so much when I was little, which you'd think would make me hate this game, but I really just can't help but love it. It may be entirely different from the Resident Evil that I fell in love with, but it's just such a genuinely incredible game on its own. Almost every single part of its design is executed so elegantly that it's no wonder that this was the game that brought RE even more into the mainstream than it already was, and still stands as one of the most beloved entries in the series more than 20 years later. There are some hiccups here and there, especially when it comes to the game's story, but on the whole, it's a beautifully executed title. There are a lot of hardcore fans of the classic Resi style that have hated this game for years thanks to it taking the franchise in a new direction, and while I personally used to be a member of that camp, I've grown to love RE4 in recent years. It definitely took things in a new direction that led to some, let's just say, questionable results. But now that Capcom has massively course-corrected the series the way they have, it's a lot easier to look back on. The Resident Evil franchise we know today is evenly split between the old-school survival horror formula and the newer action horror formula, with both styles having a number of great and not-so-great games in their lineup. And Resident Evil 4 was the lightning in the bottle that ultimately led us to where Resident Evil is now. Without RE4, we never would have received some of the greatest titles in the series, and beyond that, we wouldn't have gotten many of our favorite gaming properties outside of RE either if it weren't for its influence. Resident Evil 4 had just as much of an effect on the gaming industry as a whole as the classics like RE1 and 2 did back in their day. So to wrap this all up, I'm going to give Resident Evil 4 a 9.1. Hey guys, thanks for making it to the end of this particularly long ramble session. If you made it this far, I'm gonna assume that you enjoyed what you saw, so feel free to go ahead and leave a like or a sub to help out with that whole YouTube algorithm thing. And if you're looking to support the channel and this series in particular even further, feel free to check out things like my YouTube memberships or my Patreon and join the group of amazing people who really make this all possible. But with all that said, I'm gonna let you guys get on to the rest of your day. So thank you once again for watching, and I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.